The next time around. Blistering sun beat down upon the dry, cracked earth. The red tinge of a sunburn began to show on her fair, speckled skin. Beads of sweat formed above her upper lip and atop her brow. When the last bit of paint had been brushed onto the tiny bungalow, she tossed the brush into the nearly empty paint can. She ran a weary arm over her forehead and sighed. With their latest project now in its completion, Lily and her husband Mason would get paid, and they'd be one step closer to moving away from Solitaire Stone. Both had lived in the sandy desert valley their entire lives. Lily had grown up the daughter of a traveling salesman and a potter. Mason had worked in his father's gas station for years when he first met Lily. Both knew only of the Dust Bowl town and the small population of folks who inhabited it. It was clear when they met, though, that neither had any problem about displaying a great desire to leave the small town and seek beyond its rocky borders. Lily was a tall and slender girl, with long red hair, freckles, and deep green eyes. Mason had found her to be quite beautiful, and liked her even more when he discovered her ability to take apart a combustible engine and put it back together. Being the youngest of the family, with 3 older brothers, created a tomboyish flair, but she couldn't hide the girl beneath the baseball cap and faded jeans. The fiery long locks, paired with her long lashes and sparkly green eyes, always gave her away. Mason had a rugged exterior, but a laid-back politeness that took away from the stereotype. After a short time of dating, and with the resentment of her mother, the free-spirited 19-year-old and the soft-spoken 23-year-old married in an outdoor ceremony with 10 people in attendance. Happiness was not measured by the pair through money or possessions. They moved into a silver bullet-style trailer in the park just on the edge of town. Despite lacking the finer luxuries of life, they were happy all the same. A large glass jar which once held dill pickles now held coins and bills with a self-made label reading Dream Fund. For work, they did odd jobs in town. After piling into their old beater pickup truck, they would set out to build a shed for Old Man Meyer or lay a stone walkway for Mrs. Beekman. Evenings were spent curled on the couch, Lily chattering on about the rising level within the jar and their destinations ahead. To anyone else, they would have sounded like repetitive pipe dreams and foolish nonsense, but to Mason it sounded like poetry. The way her eyes lit up, that childlike giggle, he never got tired of it. The day had reached its highest peak, and heat waves rolled off the dry earth like steam rising from a tea kettle. With the last of the equipment piled into the rusty bed, Lily and Mason made their way to the local diner for lunch. The diner, small with a worn-down look that resembled the rest of the sleepy town, sat overlooking a series of rocky ledges. The faded sign out front read Stella's. Upon entering the building, the paint-covered duo shuffled to the back and slid into the red leather booth. Solitaire Stone was a creature of habit. Its residents rarely broke cycle. The weather was always the same, even the dogs and cats followed a monotonous order. This reliable routine included the patrons of Stella's. Any day of the week you could find Joe McNally sitting at the counter incessantly sipping on stale coffee and browsing over the daily news. The aging man wore a tan cowboy hat, which was accented with white strands of hair that poked out from beneath it. His weathered visage always seemed to be scrunched into a displeased look. The same went for the rest of the regulars at the diner, their afternoon routine spent passing time at the counter while local gossip churned out as freely as the burnt coffee and bacon. Lily rested a tired head on Mason's dusty shoulder. Stella, the owner of the eatery, meandered to the booth and pulled a pen from behind her ear. She was a no-nonsense lady in her mid-50s with graying brunette hair and squinty brown eyes, peering from behind black-rimmed glasses. She had spent her entire existence in solitaire, and since the death of her husband Mort 3 years prior, had been struggling to keep up the cafe on her own. Long hours of waiting tables, cooking, and cleaning had only helped define the ever-growing amount of wrinkles that decorated her face. "Will it be the usual for you two today?" She stood with a hunch and reached down to pull the sagging stockings that desperately clung to her varicose-speckled legs. "Yep, gotta go with the turkey club still," Mason replied. The tired woman scratched the quick order down on her pad and retreated to the kitchen window. Russ Morgan, the part-time cook, slouched lazily reading the sports section. Stella tapped a warning pen on the middle counter, and he tossed the paper aside to snatch the tablet order off the line. The two usually had a somewhat gritty relationship, but today she was simply too worn to worry. When the order was completed, she gathered up the dishes and made her way to the corner booth. Lily always ordered her turkey club on wheat toast and Mason with rye. She placed the corresponding meals in front of their owners and left the table to make rounds of coffee refills. Lily picked up the bottle of ketchup from the table and began. To attempt the annoying task of freeing the condiment from its glass container. It was after several moments of fumbling that Mason chuckled and reached out to try and help her. The calmness of the cafe was suddenly disrupted by the screeching of tires coming from outside. The loud and sudden squeal jumped her, and the bottle flew from her hands and landed, splashing ketchup across the tabletop. Several patrons jumped from their seats and dove to the windows to see what happened. Lily and Mason tried to stretch from where they were to see outside. Billowing clouds of dust rolled up over the hood of an old Chevy Blazer. When the grayish haze finally settled down, the figure of an elderly man could be seen in the middle of the road. His arms had been raised in defense of the oncoming truck, but now lowered and his body straightened up. The owner of the vehicle hollered out the window at him and waved an angry fist. With slow and rigid movements, the old man trekked to the other side of the road. When he was safely on the other side, the Blazer hurriedly peeled from the scene. It was at this time that the confusion and curiosity from inside the diner had begun to die down. The onlookers returned to their seats and returned to their regular conversations. "That poor old man," replied Lily with concern in her voice. "That driver was pretty rude. I think I'm going to go check on him." Mason considered stopping her, but he did not. He knew that Lily was just being Lily. She was sweet and caring by nature, and it was what he loved about her. As soon as she swung open the front door to the diner, she saw the man. He had found his way over to a boulder near the shore of the road and had stopped to rest. She made her way to the opposite side of the road where he sat, and when she reached him, it was clear that he was shaken by the incident. He was wheezing, hunched over, and wearing a large straw hat. His pants were covered in dirt, his shirt tattered and worn. The pathetic man made Lily's heart sink. She reached out a gentle hand and placed it on the old-timer's shoulder. For a moment, it was as if he hadn't noticed. "Are you all right, sir?" Her soft words seemed to stir from his temporary daze, and he looked up at her from beneath the shaggy hat. She could only imagine the things he had seen in his day, where he had been and who he was. The deep creases and wrinkles that covered his face seemed to tell their own story. His eyes, they were like crystal-clear marbles, the prettiest blues one could imagine. His eyes gave away a sense of youth that nowhere else in his aging body declared. At the moment those baby blues met hers, they widened and froze. He appeared completely caught off guard by her, and the sight of this woman that stood before him made his mouth hang agape. He barely blinked. He just kept staring at her as if in shock, like he had seen a ghost. Lily attributed this to his shaken state and the ordeal in which he had just been through. "Is there anything I can do for you? I saw what happened. Don't worry, not everyone in this town is like that. Most of us are actually quite nice." The man finally composed himself long enough to form words. His voice was rusty and haggard. "My sweet girl, it is so good to see you. You have no idea what it means to see you now. You're like an angel from heaven." Lily blushed and gave a quick giggle. "Well, that's very kind of you to say. Are you hurt at all?" He shook his head and took her hand, and his words were once again tired and raspy. He held an air of conviction and determination this time. "You must listen to me. This is very important, what I'm about to tell you. I know you have no reason to believe me, but you absolutely must." Lily began to feel a bit uneasy. The poor man must have been suffering from some form of heat stroke or dementia, she imagined. His eyes slowly filled with tears, and when he blinked, they spilled out into his ragged cheeks. She tried to slip her hand from out of his grasp, but he simply squeezed it tighter. "Please, I beg of you, in a day's time, you will meet someone who means you great harm. You must keep away from this person by all means necessary. Your life depends on it." "Please, sir, I'm quite certain I do not know what you're talking about. If there's anything I can do to help, I will try, but if there isn't, then I think I should be getting back to my husband." His grip loosened, and her hand was freed from his. He pulled a tattered handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped his eyes and forehead. He stood on shaky legs, and she reached out to steady him. "You were always such a kind girl. It didn't matter who they were or what they needed. You were always there to help. Life was never the same after you left. You make sure and keep your wits about you, and don't let them take you away." With that, he stuffed the rag back in his pocket and walked away up the dusty road. She stood there and watched him for a moment, puzzled by his odd requests. She shook her head, realizing that they were nothing more than the incoherent ramblings of a lonely old man. There had been something memorable about him, though, despite his strange exterior, but she just was unable to place it. She shrugged her shoulders and let out a sigh. She felt sad for him, but appeared he didn't want to accept help from her. Back at the diner, Mason had their lunch bagged up and was waiting at the front entrance, watching her with the man. When she finally returned and met him at the door, she offered up little for explanation of the peculiar gentleman she had conversed with. She decided to leave out the bizarre demands he had made of her. "He was just lonely, I suppose. I'm not sure who he was, but he seemed so sad." He put a warm arm around her bare shoulders as they walked to the truck. "Don't worry, love. You'll be all right." They climbed into the pickup and rode home. Once there, they dragged out the ladders and the paint supplies from the truck bed, piled them into a small shed nearby. Lily pulled her long red tresses from their confining ponytail and let them flow over her sunburned shoulders. She was looking forward to a nice cold shower and a full glass of lemonade. She slipped an arm around Mason's waist and leaned in for a snuggle and kiss. A wide grin crossed his face as he looked lovingly into her green eyes. He felt like the luckiest man on the entire planet. It didn't matter to him if those dollar bills ever reached the top of that pickle jar. He had all he needed right in front of him. That night he'd not been able to sleep for some reason, and the hot, stuffy camper felt even more oppressive than usual. He looked at Lily sleeping next to him. She was in a sound slumber and didn't move a muscle as he slipped out the bed and out the front door. He sat on the steps and looked up at the night sky, gazing like a child at the wonderful spectacle of glitter overhead. "It's funny. Those stars always looked so beautiful. I never would have imagined a night when I wouldn't care to glance up and see if they were even there. I haven't looked for years now." Mason was startled by the voice emerging from the darkness. He swung his head around both sides, looking to see where it came from. There, leaning against the truck, was the old man. The man took a long, silent drag from a cigarette and blew a wisp of smoke into the night air. His dimly lit luminescence gave an eerie glow to the character. The porch light flickered and then resumed. "What are you doing here?" Mason grumbled. He was surprised when the man walked right up to him. "You love her. I know that. But you've got to do more than that. You have got to keep her safe." "Listen, guy, I don't know what you're trying here, but I think it's time to leave. You have no business being here." The old man chuckled and exhaled a cloud of smoke right in Mason's face. He let out a strangled cough. The blatant disregard angered him. Who was this guy? Jumping up, Mason sternly began to accost the stranger. "It's time you leave, old man. I've asked you nicely, but I wouldn't keep pushing it. You are trespassing, and I'm well within my rights to remove you in whatever force I deem necessary." "Cool it. I'm not here to cause trouble with you or her. On the contrary, I'm trying to save the both of you. Something terrible is going to happen, and I'm here to tell you you need to do everything in your power to try and stop it. If not, the rest of your life will be a complete waste." With those words, he dropped the butt to the ground and stamped it out with his right heel. "You always hated cigarettes." Just then, he reached in his pocket and produced a small bracelet of sorts. He held it out to Mason, waiting for him to retrieve it. Even though he didn't want to, something made him take it from the man. Once in his hand, he looked down at it. The scarce glow of the porch did not provide the best of lighting, but it was easy to tell that it was a charm bracelet, with only one charm on it. It was a small blue heart. Mason rolled the bauble around in his hand, confused, but curious all at the same time. "You will see this again. It's a gift, a horrible, terrible, twisted gift. When you do, you will know that I speak the truth. It is then that you get her out of town, anywhere. Just don't let her out of your sight." Mason motioned to give the bracelet back, but the old man waved a hand at him. "No, I don't want it. I've had it for long enough already. It never did me any good." With not another breath, he turned and wandered back into the darkness in which he came. The creepiness enveloped Mason, and he shivered despite the hot, stagnant atmosphere. He must be out of his mind, he thought to himself. Just a crazy, lonely old man, just as Lily had described. Lily. She mustn't know what had happened. She would be terrified. He would do as the man had asked, to watch over her, but not because of some invisible entity, but because of that man himself. He wasn't going to take a chance that he'd be back. He obviously had some sort of fascination with her. He rose from the metal steps and opened the can of trash that stood next to him on the step. He crammed the bracelet deep into the mess of contents and replaced the lid. He wasn't quite sure how he was to sleep after that, but with a full day of chores the following day, he simply had to try. The desert was relentless in its summer rays, and they burned down upon the already scorched clay ground. The couple had just packed up their gear and were headed to Mr. Burgley's place just a few miles up the road. He was a bit of a hermit, a widower, and most often kept to himself. His roof was in need of repair, as many of the shingles had blown off over the last few seasons of windstorms. He had left it as long as he could, but upon running into Mason the week prior, he'd made the decision to finally have it repaired. They arrived just after 8 to find him on the front porch, sipping tea and working on a wood carving. He tipped the brim of his black cowboy hat as they made their way to the house, and continued on with his work without a word. The sun made waves atop the shale-covered rooftop. Lily could barely stand the perilous duty much longer, but as Mason applied the last shingle, she let out an exhausted sigh of relief. With the first task in its finality and hours having passed since last being on the ground, it was welcome to the two to be back in the truck afterwards, heading to grab gas and drinks at the station for a much-needed break. After their break, they had a broken step to fix at Miss Margaret's, and then it would be back home to try and get some things done at their own place. A tiring schedule, but the duo forged on. The gas station was like any station you might find in Middle America. The outdated signs, curled posters clinging to the walls, worn floorboards, and what would a tired classic of a place like that be without the overweight attendant hunched over the counter chewing tobacco? It'd been the same way for 20 years, and it would be there for 20 more. As Mason went for drinks, Lily decided to wait on the deck outside, fanning herself with an old engine magazine. The words from the old man from the night before had started to go stale within his mind, much like bread left out in the sun. It was easy to fall back into the unexpected, unassuming routine of the day. His hands ached, and the sweat rolled from the sides of his burned visage. Upon placing the cold beverages on the grimy counter, the bottles sweating themselves, he engaged the portly fellow in friendly conversation. The store radio screamed out a particularly loud Aerosmith tune. That useless banter between him and the slow-witted fellow continued for a bit more, and eventually Mason was aware of how long he had left poor Lily waiting for him. He dropped the appropriate bills down on the slab and jetted out the door with the perspiring bottles under his arm. He gave the rusted screen door a shove and trotted down the wooden steps. When his eyes reached the horizon, he let out a gasp. Lily was gone. The bottles dropped from his arm in a clutter to the ground. His heart lurched into his throat, and he ran both hands through his matted hair. He turned around and around. The fear, the panic, it flooded and pumped through his veins like a disease. He could barely breathe, his body heavy with the overwhelming clout of helplessness. "Lily!" he shouted, the words seeming to get lost in the hazy abyss. Then, just as he was about to run back inside to the store and alert the clerk, a familiar voice made him spin around. "Mason, what's the matter?" It was Lily. She had come from behind the store. Her face was scrunched in confusion over his display of terror. Relief was not the word to describe the way he felt at that moment. He was completely overjoyed. Running to her and scooping her up in his arms, thankful and regaining the ability to breathe once more, he twirled around with the mystified girl in his embrace. Someone looking onto the scene would have presumed them to be quite mad. "What on earth is going on?" she asked with heightened misunderstanding. "I thought I'd lost you. I came out of the store and you were gone. You scared me to death." She couldn't help but giggle. "I went to the bathroom out back. I was only gone a couple minutes. Are you all right? Maybe you've been in the sun too long." Maybe he was crazy, he thought to himself. He began to think of everything the old man had told him the night before. He was quite certain the old-timer was out of his mind. But just the idea of ever losing her put him on edge just the same. He released her and took a step back. "I'm fine, I promise. I was just worried, that's all. I'm sorry if I scared you." "Will you be all right to keep working? Do you want me to call Miss Margaret and tell her we won't be able to do the step today?" He shook his head and walked back to the fallen drinks on the ground. Upon picking them up, he reassured her. No, that's not necessary. I really am okay. I was just being foolish. Don't worry about me. He proceeded to open the truck door for her, and she hopped into the passenger side, still looking a bit concerned. He handed her the beverages and made his way around the truck and climbed in. Once they were back on the road, he silently scolded himself. He should have never left her outside alone. He stared down the road, lost in his own thoughts for some time. After a period of hushed travel, Lily spoke up suddenly. Oh, while you were in the store, there was this guy that pulled up for directions out front. He was totally lost, she snickered. I told him how to get back to the highway. Mason straightened up in his seat and turned to her. A subtle tightness twinged in the pit of his stomach. I guess he's a traveling salesman of sorts. He makes the most lovely handcrafted jewelry. He showed some to me. It was really beautiful stuff. He travels all around the country selling the pieces he makes. It was at that moment that the small twinge within him grew. He didn't have words. He just kept listening to what she was telling him with intensity. Such a nice man. He actually gave me one of his pieces. She lifted her arm and revealed a shiny, sparkling charm bracelet. The blue heart that dangled from it glittered in the sun. Mason's stomach lurched. He slammed the brake pedal all the way to the floor. The inside cab became a dust bowl, the truck halting with a loud screech. What is the matter with you? Lily gave his right arm a hard shove. You're acting like a crazy person today. Take it off, Lily, right now. I'm serious. He reached over and attempted to grab the wristlet, which she quickly fended off. What are you doing? She was astounded at his sudden range of moodiness, and this was completely uncharacteristic of him. Who gave this to you? I told you it was a salesman. Was it that old man you saw at the diner yesterday? No, not at all. This guy couldn't have been older than his early 30s. Mason's head was spinning. His entire world lacked any sense of reason. He felt angry and frightened all at once. He grabbed for her arm once more, and this time she didn't fight him. He slid the jewelry off her wrist and held it up to her. The person that gave this to you means you harm. You must promise me right here and now that if you ever see that person again, you run. A look of distaste was plastered across her face, and he wished that there was a way to properly explain his actions to her. He knew that she must be so worried about him and that he was acting reckless and irrational in her eyes. He didn't even know what was happening, so there was no way he could help her understand. He couldn't tell her about the old man. She would think he was letting the words of a fool bamboozle him. Promise me, Lily, please. It's important. She scowled at him and crossed her arms over her chest. You're totally overreacting. It was a harmless gesture by someone who was grateful for directions. You're reading into this way too much. I don't think so. I can't explain it to you, but you have to promise to stay away from that person. He was simply passing through. I can't imagine any situation where I'd ever run into that person ever again anyway. I really think you're making a big deal out of nothing. Look, you were never the possessive, jealous type before, so don't start acting like that now. I swear, Lily, this has nothing to do with jealousy. I really have a valid concern here. Whether it makes sense to you now or not, I'm simply looking out for you because I love you, and I never want to lose you. I'd never want anything bad to happen to you. I would absolutely die. You're so special to me. Her scowl softened, and the anger she had felt before started to melt away. Nothing's going to happen, baby. You need to believe that. You won't lose me. Just promise me, though, to be careful in the future when it comes to strangers. I know you love to help people, and you're naturally trusting and kind, but you can't always guarantee what people are thinking and what they're capable of. Just promise me to stay away from that man in the future, and be wary of strangers in general as well. She let out an exasperated sigh. It felt like something her mother would have said to her. She felt like she was 10 years old again. All right, Mason, I promise you, but you have to promise me something, too. What's that? She gave him a playful shove this time. That you will lighten up? You sound like Mom. He cracked a smile from the corner of his mouth for her benefit. He did not want to worry her any further. He rolled down his window and chucked the bracelet as hard as he could out into the sandy shoulder. She gave him a pout. That really was a pretty bracelet. He started the truck and headed to Mrs. Margaret's home. The job was fortunately a quick one, but all the while his mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the way his heart had felt, pounding against his chest when she had shown him the bracelet. The old man had been right, or at least it's how it appeared. When they returned that evening, his back was sore, his hands were stiff, and he couldn't shake the lingering cloud over his head. What had the old man expected him to do? Look over his shoulder for the rest of his life? Be constantly afraid of shadows and strangers at every turn? He couldn't live like that. He loved Lily more than anything in the world, and would do anything he had to do to make sure she was safe. But if he kept acting like this, she would probably leave him. Lily retired early that night and drifted off to sleep reading the adventure novel she'd been working on for the past 2 weeks. He watched her sleeping so peacefully. She was so beautiful, so full of spirit and life. He took the book from her limp hand and placed it on the nightstand. Without waking her, he made his way through the creaky camper and ended up back out on the steps he had the night before. He sat down and put his head in his hands and tried to will the answer to come to him. He lifted his head and his eyes settled on the trash can next to him. He lifted the lid and pawed through the rubbish. It wasn't long before his fingers rolled between them the metal heart charm. He pulled the bracelet out and stared at it. There it was. The old man had been telling the truth. Somehow, someway, he was right. He didn't know how he knew, but he'd known what was going to happen before it did. All of a sudden, a chill swept over him. He shivered. The feeling of eyes watching him made him turn. There, standing under the glow of the dimly lit bulb, was the old man. Mason jumped up. "How did you know what was going to happen?" He shoved the bracelet in the old man's face. "Tell me who you are and how you expect me to stop this." The creases in the old man's face shifted as a crooked frown crossed his tight lips. "You stupid fool, just keep her safe. I don't know everything. I only know what I've been through, and it was hell." "What do you mean? Don't speak to me in riddles, old man. Just tell me the truth. I want the absolute truth, here and now." The old man charged at him, grabbed him by the shoulders, and pushed his face almost into his own. "Don't you get it? I'm you. You're me. When Lily disappeared 40 years ago, I felt like I died. She was everything to me, and I lost her. She took the truck to get some groceries, and I stayed behind to fix the sink. It was leaking. She never came back. I waited for a long time, and when I finally decided to walk to the store, I found the truck a half a mile up the road. The doors wide open, and sitting on the hood was that damn bracelet." Mason wrenched himself free from his grip. He was terrified. "No, that can't be possible. I don't believe that." "Well, frankly, I don't care what you think. You just better keep her safe. Leave town, something. Don't let her leave tomorrow. You pack up your stuff and you leave. I don't know what that bracelet means, but I know it's from the same person that took her. I spent years scouring this area, talking to cops, posting flyers, smoked 1,000 cigarettes. I found out that there was another case upstate 4 months earlier where another young girl was taken and never seen again. The only thing left behind was the bracelet, the exact same bracelet he gave to Lily. It couldn't be true. What the old man spoke of, it defied all reason. Mason stumbled and fell back onto the metal steps with a clang. "If what you say is true, then why didn't you tell me to stay away from the gas station? Then he never would have met her and she would have been safe." "Who's to say how long he would have stayed in town if he wouldn't have met her somewhere else or at another time? Besides, would you believe me if I told you?" Mason had to admit that he wouldn't because, up until this moment, he had taken everything he had said with a grain of salt. "That bracelet was my only piece of actual proof that I was telling you the truth. I had to take that chance. My life was never the same without her. I became a faded shell of the man I once was, just drying up and waiting to die. And then one day I did. 64 years old, 40 years spent without her. It was unbearable." Mason tripped off the steps and held up his arm. "Stay away from me. You're crazy. What you say isn't true." The old man lurched at him angrily. "Oh, it's true, believe it. I died. I'm dead. The ghost of a man left hollow and shattered. I don't know how I ever made it back here, but when I died, I never crossed over. I never met with judgment, and I know why. My spirit can't rest without her. It won't, and I will haunt you every second to make sure you change this." Mason sat, eyes wide, lying in the gravel, staring up at this ratty figure towering over him. If this was true, his own ghost had come back to save Lily and save himself from a life of torture and unsettled death. It was astonishing, to say the least. The old man let out a loud cough and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "I never could stand this damn heat. You leave. You leave first thing she wakes up. That dream we always had, of adventure and travel, you go do it. Now, one thing life has taught me, you can't always take things for granted. You can't assume things will always stay the same, that nothing will ever change. Give her that dream she's always wanted. Don't wait until you have enough money to buy a huge house somewhere. That's not what either of you want anyway." Tears began to well up in his eyes, and he turned and stared at the bedroom window. "I wish I could see her one more time before I left for good." The sincerity in his voice, the conviction of his words, added with everything he seemed to know, Mason finally believed him. If Lily had disappeared from his life, he could very well imagine everything the man spoke of happening to him. He would do all he could to make sure what happened never happened this next time around. I promise, I'll do everything in my power to protect her. We will leave first thing in the morning. And if this works, then this won't be the last time you see her. The old man nodded and silently left. Mason sat and stared out into the darkness in which he disappeared. He sat there for a good half-hour trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. The camper behind him suddenly creaked from somewhere inside. Lily was up. A few moments later, the camper door swung open and she stuck her head out into the night. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, yawning. "I couldn't sleep. Don't worry. I'm coming back to bed. Sorry if I woke you." "No, you didn't. I woke up because that darn faucet in the kitchen sink is leaking. It was driving me crazy. Do you think you could fix that in the morning?" Mason didn't need one more reason to wait one more second and continue to tempt fate. He stood up and grabbed her by the hand, hurriedly ushering her inside. "What's the matter now?" She shook her head at him and put a hand on his forehead. "I really think you're starting to lose it lately." "No, really, I'm fine. In fact, I want to ask you something." She raised her eyebrow and crossed her arms over her chest. "What is it, Mason? Please just tell me what's going on. What would you say if we packed up and left tomorrow? Left like we've been saying that we were going to all this time. You know, really do it. Go on the adventure we've worked so hard for. I think we should just do it, first thing in the morning." She cocked her head to the side, trying hard to figure out if he was serious or just delusional. "What about the jar? Shouldn't we wait until we have a little more? We have been saying that forever now. You can't always wait for the perfect time to do something, or it might never come. You're all I need in this world, and if we spend the rest of our lives living in this camper on the road, then that would be fine by me. As long as I have you, I have all I need." She believed him. He could see it on her face. The way her eyes sparkled and lit up, the excitement started to build within her. She looked like a child on Christmas morning. "Oh, Mason, of course I will run away with you." She burst out laughing and jumped into his arms. They were surprised how quickly everything was hooked up, packed up, and ready to go. They felt bundled with excitement and wonder. They made one last stop before rolling out of town, and it was Lily's parents' home to inform them of their impending journey. Not surprisingly, they tried to talk her out of it. They had hoped that over time she would change her mind about actually leaving town. Despite their reluctance, they could see she was adamant, and they hugged her goodbye with their blessings. Later that morning, the gossip about the departure of Lily and Mason had reached the diner. From the corner booth, Stella could be overheard gabbing about the pair, especially Lily, the young redhead who always lit up a room. As she meandered over to the new customer sitting alone in the corner, she hollered over her shoulder, "Gina, can you come pick up this table?" The peppy blonde girl gladly came from out behind the front counter and cheerfully joined the haggard woman at the table. Stella laid a coffee cup in front of the clean-cut gentleman and handed the full pot to the smiling blonde girl. "This is Gina, the latest addition to the cafe. She shall be taking care of you this morning." Stella turned and walked to the kitchen, barking out at the cook as she crossed through the double doors. "What can I get you today?" Gina grinned politely at the man and removed a notebook from her apron. "Just coffee for me, thanks." The handsome stranger looked out at her from behind dark frames. "I'm actually on my way back to the highway. I'm a salesman, and I have a convention to get to." Gina giggled and leaned over the map he had spread out over the tabletop. She ran her finger along the route with an invisible line back to the highway as he nodded civilly. "Thank you. You would think, as much time as I spend on the road, I'd be a pro at maps by now. You have no idea how much time you just saved me. I am truly in your debt." He shifted in his seat and drew something gleaming from his pocket. "I don't suppose you would accept this token of my gratitude, would you? I handcrafted these myself, and sell them all over the country." The girl blushed and shook her head. "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly take that from you." He laughed softly. "Please, I insist. It is of no trouble of mine to give this away. Besides, it really would look perfect on you." He handed the piece to her, and she slid it over her slender wrist. "Well, if you insist, thank you very much. It's exquisite." She turned her wrist back and forth, playfully admiring the sparkle it created in the glow of the bright cafe lights.